Howdy, folks. It's Professor Keegan here. Thank you so much for your patience today as I recover from a nasty virus. There are so many of them going around. I hope you're well. Um, I am going to quickly explain a little bit about what you're looking at right now, which is the queer or trans artifact curation project that we're going to be doing in class. This isn't due till pretty far into the semester, actually December 5th, but it is something that's going to take some preparation time and some technical sort of organization slash whiz bang. So it's something to start thinking about basically now that the midterm's in. I'm going to talk you through it. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions. And also, this is an assignment I have only taught at other institutions that had different systems in place. So we may run into some technical issues or have to sort of slightly change or alter this assignment, but the basic structure will remain the same. So I'm going to talk about that. This sheet is already uploaded on Moodle in this week's block. If you previously grabbed it, please re-download it because I made a few changes this morning to it. Once I was on better flu medication, I was like, oh. So I think it's a little better structured right now. But yeah, I'll talk you through it. I'll talk a little bit about the material, and then I've also posted a very short forum, open forum discussion about a couple of examples of further creative work I'd like you to take a look at this evening or tomorrow. I'd like to have posts in that forum in by the end of Thursday at the latest. So I'll remind you to travel over there and take a look at that prompt when I'm done talking. Okay, so first of all, as I mentioned, due December 5th. This is due before the final essay is due. So, it's meant to be due kind of at the very end of our class meetings schedule, and then you'll have your final due after that. What you're going to do, and this is a good place to start with this project, is to start going into these digital collections I've given you here that are all linked in the PDF if you download it. And find a cultural artifact that can be an event or object created by a queer or trans person. It can be a poster, a song, a protest, a painting, fashion, right, from a particular period. It's really broadly constructed. Anything that's been created by a queer or trans author, right? Something that interests you, that connects to your own, I don't know, background, major, fandoms, whatever. We have a pretty broad range of things to pick from here. And I've picked archives that I think have a range of content that have really good online digital exhibitions and collections. So just start poking around in here. The idea is to find something you think works well with the framework of the class and that also matches your interests. You're going to be curating this object for the class, well, for your group, right? So it's important to think about something that you think you could talk effectively about, something that you feel like you could share using course concepts in a way that you could talk about further, right, with the group of people you've been talking with online already. So I'd ask you to start thinking about this and looking around in these archives. Once you've picked something, you're going to share, I'm going to create a forum for this, but you're going to be sharing a link or example of it in your journal group so that people can kind of look in advance at what you're going to be talking about. And each of your group members is going to develop one good question per artifact in the group. So let's say you have 4 group members. Each group member uploads a sample of their artifact, and each group member then is going to create one good question about the 3 other people's artifacts, okay? So that's sort of a secondary step in the process. Once you've done that, you're going to start doing research on your artifact. You can use the archive that you pulled it from. You can do additional sort of light internet-based or library research on it just to find out a little bit more about the creator, the context, the time period, the cultural context, right? And then you're going to be writing, along with some course sources, I'm going to ask you to apply at least 2 to the text or artifact, a 5-minute curation statement. Now, this cannot be longer than 5 minutes. If it goes longer, your eventual discussion is going to get longer and longer and longer, and we just really don't want that. We want succinct, clear analysis. So shoot for 5 minutes. Slightly longer is okay, but if it goes to 7, 8, 9 minutes, it's going to create a lot of problems across the course. So practice this. Once you get it written, make sure you can do it in about 5 minutes, okay? And you should be answering these 3 questions. Again, if you spend 2 minutes per question, that should be enough, right? So write succinctly. You can even write in the sheet to practice. 1, what is it, right? Tell us a bit about it using research you've gathered. 2, what is your reason for choosing it? How does it help us better understand queer and trans culture? Show some examples maybe to remind us what it is. And 3, then situate the artifact in the context of at least 2 course sources and sort of explain how it fits into the framework of the course and your understanding of queer and trans studies that you've gleaned from kind of being in community in the class. The last step is the hardest, so I would start working on 1 and 2. Make sure they're a tight 3 minutes max, maybe, so that you have a little room in the 3rd step to burn 2 to 3-ish minutes talking about why you found the artifact meaning in terms of course sources and course materials. So that's all prep work. Toward the end of November, I'm going to be reminding you about this, but your group is going to get together via Zoom. Someone is going to have to take over kind of like Zoom responsibility in the group using Concordia's Zoom platform. And each one of you in that Zoom room is going to deliver your creation statement. You can just read it off your sheet, and then field at least 1 question from each group member. Again, these are questions the group members have generated to, promote discussion of your artifact. So you'll answer a question from each group member. Depending on the number of people in your group, this could go shorter or longer, but we're looking for at least 15 minutes of discussion per group member. So if there's only 2 of you, half an hour, 3 of you, 45 minutes, etc. All group members will be evaluated on curation statement as well as quality of engagement. Okay, and what you're going to do is you're going to record this session and upload it to Moodle for Andres and I to review. We just don't have enough time as a huge class to get together and share all this stuff in 1 session. So this is a way of us each learning a bit from other people in our group and Andres and I being able to look at all the stuff you found on our end. We can talk more about technical approaches to doing this. I like to, as I'm doing today, record on Moodle or record on Zoom. I compress to QuickTime to about 720p. That's usually good enough. Then I throw it onto YouTube and YouTube saves it and will auto caption it as well if it sits there long enough. That's a really great way to back up your work on YouTube servers, which are far more resilient and secure than anything I could ever purchase. So that's one way of doing it. I can show you how to do that. You might have other ways of saving or cloud saving video, long video. But we're going to be available to help you do this if you can't figure it out, okay? So I'm sure you'll have questions about this. We will work through them over the course of the semester. I'm going to be answering questions about this next week when I'm feeling a little better. But just FYI, the sheet is here in the week 7 block. Download it. Start thinking about these archives. Don't just click through the archives in order because some of the ones a little bit deeper in are way interesting. Click around in there. Find something that you think it will help you expand your thinking or help you talk about a set of issues you are invested in. Okay. So I am going to take us over to class notes. Okay. I've already looked at a number of your discussion journals and really pleased with your reaction to this material. I think it builds really naturally, haha, in scare quotes, on themes from last week. And also I think has a nice kind of Halloween season vibe going on about monsters and monstrous bodies, monstrous methods, which we'll talk a little bit about today. So again, this is week 7, aesthetics and embodiment 2. And we're really just adding to the discussion we developed with the discussion of embodiment, visibility, aesthetics from last week. So briefly, This piece, My Words to Victor Frankenstein, Above the Village of Chamonix, Performing Transgender Rage, is a really important work. We've read some of the foundational works in queer theory and queer studies in this class very early on in the semester, especially with Sedgwick. But I wanted you to get exposure to very early work in trans studies, which is coming out right at the same time as that early queer theory. So I had you take a look at Stryker, this piece by Stryker, which is considered foundational. It was initially published in the first volume of GLQ in 1994, which is the first academic journal committed entirely to queer theory. We've actually looked at some work published in GLQ already. But this piece appeared very early, I think in the second issue of the first volume of that journal. As you may have picked up from reading it, it describes the meeting between a politicized transgender subjectivity and its creators, the medical industry, using the figure of Frankenstein's monster and Victor Frankenstein, right? And in doing this, Stryker is drawing on a long tradition of sort of referring to transsexuality as a Frankensteinian creation of science, particularly in what we would now call TERF discourses. There was a real dismissal of trans people as sort of medically constructed oddities that proliferated through certain areas of feminist theory in the 1970s. So this is Stryker responding to that by, instead of deflecting it and saying, no, we are completely normal people and we just have this illness that needs treatment, it's her kind of leaning into the stereotype of the monster, right? So the main point here really, and I want you to start understanding methods here, right? There's a method to sort of occupying the position you're assigned to versus rejecting it. Stryker claims the trans body as what we would say resistantly unnatural, in scare quotes, monstrous and radical, a creation that warns and speaks back through what Foucault would call reverse discourse, right? So there's this great moment where Stryker looks at the root formation of the word monster, which in Latin means to warn. Monsters show up to indicate a boundary violation or to indicate that something has gone wrong, right? Think about horror movies. Here we are in Halloween season, right? The monster almost always lingers around a site of trauma, injustice, a secret that needs to be disclosed, someone who's done something wrong that needs to come to light, right? So the monster hovers around these questions of truth and of violation in a lot of ways, okay? So reverse discourse is Foucault's term for how power can be reversed through the reclaiming of stigmatizing terminology. And we've seen this already with things like queer, right? In disability studies, the term crip is often used to claim a more resistant relationship to the naming structures, the taxonomic structures of the medical gaze. Also, some things like slut, right? Words that have been reclaimed to take away their power or to siphon it off and use it in new and different ways. So, you know, Stryker saying, yeah, I am a monster. And guess what? Monsters are really powerful. And there's a reason why people are scared of them, right? So using the structure of reverse discourse, Stryker is, you know, this piece is called Performing Transgender Rage because it's about the use of rage to formally deconstruct the prisons of the natural and social order. And remember, she's saying that nature is constructed, that anything that exists in the world is natural. So how can trans people be unnatural, right? There's something we call nature that is itself unnatural, is a construction. So Stryker is using reverse discourse to really reverse medical discourse, the medical discourse that constructs what we would call transsexuality as a disorder, instead revealing how all sex and gendered subjects are similarly as constructed as trans people are, right? She says all bodies that exist are equally natural and unnatural, equally produced and equally arising honestly from their own natural condition. So this whole division of monster and creator is bullshit. We're all the monster, right? And we're all the creator too. Um, and so, she's literally saying, right, I want to lay claim to the dark power of my monstrous identity without using it as a weapon against others or being wounded by it myself. I will say this as bluntly as I know how. I am a transsexual and therefore I am a monster. By embracing and accepting these words, creature, monster, unnatural, even piling one on top of another, we may dispel their ability to harm us. I wonder what Stryker thinks of all these moves to kind of claim transness as valid or, um, you know, represent transness positively, when what she's really saying is that the power of transness is a dark power, is a power to tear apart and destroy. And, right now, we see a lot of we made a lot of concessions in trans politics, I think, to try to be nice and fit in and be happy, shiny, little cute trans people who just want to have our pronouns recognized. And it didn't go very well, right? So I sometimes wonder if we should have been a bit more radical. And I wonder what Stryker thinks about that 25 plus years later. So of course, Stryker is also referencing the history of Frankenstein's monster as a construct, a figure, right? And how in both the novel, more so in the novel than the movie, actually, because in the novel, Frankenstein's monster like tracks down the doctor, confronts him, says, I never asked you to create me in the first place, and then systematically murders everybody the doctor loves. So it's a little, and then escapes, right? Escapes off into the Antarctic where he's never found. Um, so, Stryker's referencing the history of this figure, but also saying, that the monster does end up turning around and confronting the creator and saying, what did you think you were doing? Did you think I would be just your little pet, your toy? Did you think I was your object? I'm a subject. She writes, as we rise up from the operating tables of our rebirth, we transsexuals are something more and something other than the creatures our makers intended us to be. And so even here, you can see the beginning of something that we now call trans or transgender. Transsexuality, even as late as the 1990s, was still a very medicalized term, as a term developed by the medical industry to name a disorder through which then trans people could get medical treatment, right? But Stryker's saying, no, this is far more than just a medical disorder that can be treated by and fixed by medical authorities. So we see the very beginning of, hey, there's a mode of analysis here. There are forms of knowledge we can arrive at from this position of transness. And it's not just a pathology, it's something far larger. I want to talk a bit about Stryker's methods in this piece, because this text itself is monstrous. I don't know if you noticed how it's put together, but it is cobbled together from pieces that don't fit, just like the monster's body in Frankenstein, right? Which is sewn together from the cadavers dug up from different graves. So yeah, ooh, Halloween themes. But I wanted to direct you to this conference panel that happened celebrating the essay's 25th anniversary in 2019, where Stryker actually discusses the methods she used to compose this monstrous essay, which then gave birth to what we might say the modern field of transgender studies. Trans studies is older than this, but this is the moment where trans studies arrived kind of in the center of academia. And I have this panel linked here in the slide notes that I'll put up, if you want to watch the whole thing or more of it. But I'm just going to have us watch about 6 minutes where she talks about how she went about creating this. Taking you over to YouTube.
I remember hearing the lesbian performance artist Holly Hughes saying once that the secret to creativity is a firm deadline and an empty bank account. That was certainly true for what happened next. My bank account was always empty in those days, and the Rage Against the Disciplines conference was coming up in less than a week. My paper was still just a twinkle in my eye, and I had a very narrow window of opportunity for pulling it all together. I had been journaling about it, had felt the mood turn from the sort of arch and wry voice that I had initially imagined for the monster into something more rageful. I had written some of the more florid bits already, the opening paragraph, the etymology of the word monster, the bit about looking at the transsexual to discover the seams and sutures in oneself, and the monstrous benediction about rage informing action to transform world that had found its way into the APA protest speech. I was still imagining the conference presentation as a coherent talk on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with an argument, a beginning, a middle, and an end, albeit a talk delivered by a performance persona that was enacting its rage. But I just hadn't pulled it all together yet, and I was running out of time. Necessity truly is the mother of invention. It was the dead of night. On the last night I would have, the last night I would have a chance to write before heading into the conference. I was alone at my desk, anxious, stressed out, transcribing into my desktop computer the bits of journal entries that I had intended for the paper all along, as well as my reading notes on Frankenstein criticism. There was a copy of GLQ, the premier and brand new queer theory journal, volume 1, number 1, published just a few months early, with that marvelous pair of opening articles on shame by Eve Sedgwick and Judith Butler that I'd been reading repeatedly and wanted to work into my paper somehow. There was a file folder of old photocopies of newspaper articles about transgender people that had appeared in the queer press, mostly from a transphobic radical feminist perspective, many of them inspired by the formation of Transgender Nation, which had set off a trans-related moral panic in San Francisco, not unlike the one the UK is experiencing now. But it also included other archival research that I'd been doing at the Gay and Lesbian Historical Society that allowed me to trace the genealogies of those, TERF, trans-exclusive radical feminist discourses. A number of these articles made allusions to Frankenstein, and I'd started mechanically typing in that material that I thought I might want to quote somehow, such as a story about Felisa Vistima in Portland, Oregon, a trans woman who had committed suicide because she said she felt like Frankenstein's monster. But I did not see how the parts that I was assembling could add up into the performance paper that I had envisioned. And then the only words I have to describe for what happened next is that the listless, disarticulated assemblage of words on the screen began to come alive of their own accord. The spark that animated them and began to draw them together did not come from me. It was immanent in the material. It felt like I was experiencing generativity happening through me, not that I was making it happen. I was simply writing down what was happening like a report, transferring that generative process into language. I saw that I didn't need to craft a seamless narrative in a single voice, the way I'd been schooled to write as a historian. That felt too much like a kind of domination or an imposition of perspective on material that was actually richer than my perspective. Just letting one kind of text, things in the article are called the monologue, criticism for my reading notes, the newspaper clippings, the thoughts on queer theory, just letting these different texts bump up against each other, relatively raw and undigested, created a different kind of narrative sense, something that moved at a different temporality, like a jump cut in cinema, where meaning is conveyed precisely by what is not seen. I saw that the monster in the piece was speaking not as a character that I was trying to create, but as a figuration, something akin to Donna Haraway's Cyborg or Gloria Anzaldua's New Mestiza, something that spoke in the mode of an individual subject to articulate its location as a particular node in a web of power relations. I saw too that something felt like it was missing and that the piece was still too short for its time slot at the conference. I think my only real contribution to what transpired during the writing process was the conscious decision to graft in a slightly reworked passage of my journal that recounted the complex feelings surrounding my daughter's birth and the queer kinship network in which we were enmeshed, as a way of reconnecting me as the writer to the content of the paper and to conflate my voice with the speaking position of the monsters. The bit in that section about the swimmer being underwater, reaching the surface over and over again and still being underwater, that was new writing that night, drawn from an actual recurring dream that I interpolated into the journal's text. The part that looks like poetry because of how I made the lines break was also new writing, written as prose, and then simply the words, I rearranged the words physically to change its apparent genre to make it look like poetry, which I felt was a very transsexual thing to do with words. And then it was finished, a first and only draft, born in a single night. And I went to that conference in San Marcos to deliver it. I have to say, I find it remarkable that a quarter century later, I am standing in an auditorium at Cambridge telling a story about how that piece of writing came into the world.
Okay, so I think it's so fascinating to hear Stryker talk about her own essay as if it itself is a Frankenstein's monster made out of pieces and parts, right? And so as we look at these materials in class, I want you to be thinking about, what are the aesthetic strategies at play in any queer or transcultural production, including something that looks like a piece of academic theory, right? There's still a method to articulating space in which queer and trans meaning can happen, right? And it's so crucial to be able to do this. And I think we all, as queer or trans subjects, if we are, learn how to do this, but knowing that we're doing it and being able to talk and share about how to do it with others is really crucial to the formation of what we would call LGBTQ culture, right? So these more formal pieces of academic writing are still culture, and it's still worth thinking about them as containing aesthetic strategies, tactics, approaches. Okay, so let's go back over to my notes. So we could, let's go to this slideshow here. We could ask, what does if the monster exists to warn, right? And I'd like you to keep that in mind for any horror film you might watch this season. Then what does the monster warn us of? And it's very clear in Stryker's work because she says, "Hearken unto me, fellow creatures, I who have dwelt in a form unmatched with my desire, I whose flesh has become an assemblage of incongruous anatomical parts, I who achieved the similitude of a natural body only through an unnatural process, I offer you this warning. The nature, capital N, you bedevil me with is a lie. Do not trust it to protect you from what I represent, for it is a fabrication that cloaks the groundlessness of the privilege you seek to maintain for yourself at my expense. You are as constructed as me. The same anarchic womb has birthed us both. I call upon you to investigate your nature as I have been compelled to confront mine. I challenge you to risk abjection and flourish as well as I have. Heed my words, and you may well discover the seams and sutures in yourself." I think this represents a challenge that almost 30 years later, we still haven't gotten to, right? Stryker's saying, hey, yo, cis folks, cis doesn't exist. We're all constructed. We're all technologically enhanced. Your privilege is constructed through this fake idea of nature that then you use to oppress people like me and then justify your own value against, right? So I think here we see the beginning of a modern trans politics being articulated that isn't so much about just allowing trans bodies to exist, but what the implications of that are for sort of bodies that are understood as natural by contrast. So how do we add Claire and Wynn to this? Because there's a lot going on in these pieces, right? I would say that each author this week is addressing the fundamental structures that ground assumptions that trans, intersex, and disabled bodies are unnatural, right? In different ways. So if you've read Eli Clare et al., you might be aware that his work is foundational to what we would say call CRIP theory, the combination of disability and queer studies, and also the redefinition of disability as being created by the built and social environments rather than being in the body. So Claire has really helped popularize the awareness that disability is produced. It's produced by the way we design social structures and built environments rather than it being a condition in the body. Some bodies do have impairments, right? They can't do certain things biologically, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily disabled. Like I can't see, but because society has decided to create glasses, I don't suffer from an impairment, or my impairment doesn't turn into a disability, right? But I have a disability. Like I could have a disability if glasses didn't exist, but I don't because they do. Does that make sense? So yeah, I have an impairment, but I'm not disabled because there's a technology, assistive technology that's considered normal, right? So again, just like Stryker says, hey, cisness isn't real, it's constructed. Clara saying, hey, able-bodiedness also kind of isn't real, it's constructed. And disability is also constructed by systems that produce able-bodiedness. Wynne, or ContraPoints, points out very similarly to Stryker and like 25 years later, right, that all genders and bodies are technologically and medically enhanced, not only trans bodies, that our concept of beauty is one that really depends on a lot of alteration, enhancement, fakeness, right? The things that tend to get trans people tend to get accused of are very much embedded in our traditions of, the beautiful like form and classical forms of high culture as well. So, all these authors are talking about the same structures in different ways, right? So it's the colonial presumption that white, cis, able-bodiedness is natural and ideal that actually produces the hierarchies that each of these authors are describing. Now, I think it can be heavy to sit with that, right? Each author is operating from a pretty fraught position, right? There's a lot of negative affect here. There's a lot of paradox to manage. So I don't want to stay just in the effects of this too long. What I want to make you start thinking about, because we're in the second half of class, is actually how each author is offering tactics for resistance, okay? I want us all to get better at noticing how resistance takes place and what kinds of methods, creative strategies, what kinds of openings we can create through those things. So I would ask you to think about how each author here uses a set of what we would call formal aesthetic methods, the arrangement of meaning through form, right? Particularly the sort of meaning that for queer and trans people is beautiful, that offers relief, that offers space, livable space in response to the systems they're addressing. So just quickly, right? Stryker is clearly using rage as an affect. And we could say, borrowing from Singer, that her essay really borrows this idea of the sublime, that the essay is too big for any one medium. The meaning is too powerful for any one style of writing, right? So what we see is a monstrous organic form that is, mutating through all these different shapes and styles. There's a sewn togetherness that the essay has that is referencing the trans body, but also saying all bodies are sewn together, right? There's the deprioritization of a single medium as more authentic or authoritative than any other kind of meaning. So she pushes like theory right up against her journal entries, right? And what I would call mutually assured deconstruction, which is like, hey, if I have to not be an integrated subject because of how my body is produced, then you don't get to be one either, right? So that's one approach. There's also Claire, which we could say is a text interested in offering one, ambivalence, because of the way that it pushes together natural systems with artificial human systems in this constant contrast that produces a real splitting in the text, but also the way in which it offers poesis, right? All the use of poetry here to suggest that there is a way to escape from determinative medical language. Poesis being the way in which new meaning is created through unprecedented uses of language and formal arrangements of words and the creation of poetry. So Claire is using that ambivalence to forward poesis as a solution to the problems that he's writing about, contrasting natural systems with the artificiality of colonial and ableist meaning, and offering a way forward through the sort of catharsis of poetry. Then there's Win, and she very clearly, if you got to the end of her video essay, offers style as a solution. Rather than beauty, right? She starts out with the problem of beauty. The whole video is called Beauty, which we've studied a little bit, right? And she says, hey, we might not be able to fully inhabit beauty, or we might not want to, but we can use style to expand what beauty means, right? So here what we see is this idea of arriving at beauty through self-elaboration of style. There's also when uses long form approaches, durational approaches, her videos are really long, right? She uses that to perform a sort of ironic pressure on the system she's critiquing, where she constantly kind of flips through all the ways that it doesn't make sense, right? In order to kind of create more and more and more and more sort of ironic space inside of her own analysis. There's an expansion she's performing. And in this video, she's performing that expansion by kind of getting inside beauty, because she shows us how her face has changed, right? I was like, I got inside it through FFS, but now I'm going to do this. I'm going to expand. I'm going to create internal pressure against the norms and create more space for more people, right? So expanding beauty through willful occupation. It's very similar to Cameron's work, God's Will, from last week, in a way, as well as all this work to detach beauty from naturalness through the way that she deconstructs cisness as an ideal form by showing how constructed it really is, right? So whether it's rage, poesis, or style, whether it's sublimity, ambivalence, or beauty, we see these artists and writers working to create a space in which trans and queer people can kind of get a breathing room, can get some way of making different sorts of meaning, creating what I would call livable space within these systems, because the systems can seem very totalizing, but they're not, right? If they were, queer and trans people wouldn't have created the cultures we have. So they are able to be resisted, even if not in totality. They don't apply in totality, and they cannot necessarily be resisted in totality, right? So I'd like you to start thinking a little bit more about what these creators are doing formally to create space for their ideas to happen in. And that goes to the discussion question and the discussion forum I've posted under this week's block in Moodle, where I have 2 pieces linked that I'd like you to take a look at, work from Zachary Drucker and Edie Fake. I'd like you to pick one of them and write at least 100 words about how you think one of them uses formal aesthetic strategies to create space for resistance from the dominant gaze. Some things to think about here. First, think about formal elements to get started. What is the organization of each piece? What images or symbols are forwarded? Why? What color, shapes, patterns, sounds are used? Maybe why? What perspective and directionality are used? One of these is a performance piece. One of these is a 2-dimensional flat painting, right? Those are very different forms of visual engagement. One has sound, one doesn't. One moves, one doesn't. What does that do, right? Take a look at the titles. What might they mean? And then once you've kind of got a handle on what you think about the content, formal content, I'd like you to think secondarily about each piece's approach to visibility. They are visual works, right? What are they saying about visibility? What are they showing us? What are they not showing us? And how are these works trans or queer instances of artistic production? Now, there is no right answer to these questions. I'm just seeing what you do with these pieces of work. So it's more about your own interpretive stance and what you can draw out of them as a viewer. Okay, so I will leave it there, and I hope you have a great evening. I will see you next week.